From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
An education secretary who is unwilling to cut off federal aid to colleges that break the law and cheat students would be a disaster for both students and for taxpayers.
As student debt reaches $1.4 trillion, the top student loan watchdog resigns in protest of the Trump administration favoring powerful predatory lenders over debt-ridden families. We'll speak with Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Rab, author of Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream. Then books, not magazines. As students across the country return to school, we look at a Trump-DeVos proposal to spend federal funds on guns and gun training for teachers.
It's called concealed carry, where a teacher would have a concealed gun on them. They'd go for special training, and they would be there, and you would no longer have a gun-free zone. Gun-free zone to a maniac, because they're all cowards. A gun-free zone is let's go in and let's attack, because bullets aren't coming back at us.
We'll speak with Adam Skaggs, Chief Counsel at the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, and Randy Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers. Then to Texas to speak with a woman sentenced to 5 years in prison for voter fraud for casting a provisional ballot in the 2016 election. She didn't realize her past conviction barred her from voting in Texas. Thursday, she could have even more time added to her sentence. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Puerto Rico has officially raised the death toll from Hurricane Maria last year from 64 to nearly 3,000 following the release of a study ordered by the governor of Puerto Rico. This officially makes Maria one of the deadliest storms in U.S. history. Puerto Rican Governor Ricardo Rosselló acknowledged the higher death count Tuesday.
I am announcing as well that we are, even though it is an estimate, we are officially changing or we are actually putting an official number to the death toll. We will take the 2,975 number as the official estimate for the excess deaths as a product of Maria.
President Trump has so far not responded to the new official death toll, which is 46 times higher than the initial count. But in October, during a visit to Puerto Rico, Trump boasted about the low official death count.
Look at a real catastrophe like Katrina, and you look at the tremendous hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that died, and you look at what happened here with really a storm that was just totally overpowering. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. Now, what is your death count as of this moment? 17?
16 certified.
16 people certified. 16 people versus in the thousands. You can be very proud of all of your people, all of our people working together. 16 versus literally thousands of people.
While Puerto Rico is now putting the death toll at 2,975, Hurricane Katrina was 1,833. Other studies show the actual death toll from Hurricane Maria may be considerably higher. In May, a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine found the death toll to be at least 4,645 and perhaps as high as 5,740 people dead as a result of Hurricane Maria. In Florida, progressive Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum pulled off a stunning upset in the Democratic primary for Florida governor. If he wins in November, Gillum will become Florida's first African-American governor. Polls had predicted Gillum would place fourth. He was backed by Bernie Sanders, spent millions of dollars less than his better-funded opponents, including former Congresswoman Gwen Graham, the daughter of Bob Graham, the former governor and senator from Florida. Gillum was the only non-millionaire in the five-candidate Democratic race. On the campaign trail, Gillum had called for Medicare for all, abolishing ICE, reforming the criminal justice system, repealing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, and increasing corporate taxes. He held a victory celebration in Tallahassee Tuesday night.
We together with all of you, over the next several months are going to make our way all across the state of Florida to red counties, to blue counties, to purple counties. And we're going to unite this state in ways that are unparalleled in the history of the state of Florida.
Andrew Gillum will now face off against Republican Congressmember Ron DeSantis, who won the Republican primary Tuesday after receiving the backing of Donald Trump. Democrats have now made history by picking 3 African-American gubernatorial candidates in this year's primaries: Andrew Gillum in Florida, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and Ben Jealous in Maryland. Meanwhile, in Arizona, another Trump-backed candidate, Congresswoman Martha McSally, easily won the Arizona Republican Senate primary, defeating Kelly Ward and former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. In other election news, the New York Times is reporting President Trump warned evangelical leaders Monday Democrats will enact change quickly and violently if they take control of Congress in the midterm elections. During a private meeting at the White House, Trump went on to say, quote, "They will end everything immediately. When you look at Antifa and you look at some of these groups, these are violent people." The White House has refused to elaborate on what the president meant. In Texas, former Balch Springs police officer Roy Oliver has been convicted of murder for killing unarmed 15-year-old African-American student Jordan Edwards last year. Police body cam video shows Oliver, who's white, fired his assault rifle into a car carrying 5 black teenagers as they drove away from the officer. One of the car's passengers says the officer never even ordered the boys to stop driving before opening fire. They had been leaving a party. In education news, teacher strikes in 2 districts in Washington state forced the cancellation of the first day of school Tuesday. Strikes are expected to begin in 4 more districts today. Meanwhile, in Seattle, teachers and school staff have voted to authorize a strike next week if a tentative contract is not reached by the first day of school, September 5th. At the United Nations, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is urging serious consideration of a new UN report that called for Burma's military commander-in-chief and other generals be tried for genocide for their targeting of Rohingya Muslims.
Accountability is essential for genuine reconciliation between all ethnic groups and is a prerequisite for regional security and stability. Regrettably, Myanmar has refused to cooperate with the United Nations human rights entities and mechanisms, despite repeated calls to do so, including by members of this council.
Meanwhile, displaced Rohingyas have welcomed the UN report, saying Burmese officials must be held accountable.
The military committed most of the tortures, and there were also border guards and police. Actually, all the government forces committed all sorts of torture on us. They raped our women, killed people with bullets, threw and killed small children, burned our houses, and now there is no place to stay. We have nothing there. So we demand to the UN that they give us justice. We need our citizenship back.
The Indian government has conducted raids across India this week, targeting prominent human rights activists, lawyers and critics of the Narendra Modi government. At least 5 people were arrested. The novelist Arundhati Roy told the Hindustan Times, quote, that the raids are taking place on the homes of lawyers, poets, writers, Dalit rights activists and intellectuals, instead of on those who make up lynch mobs and murder people in broad daylight. Tells us very clearly where India is headed, Arundhati Roy said. France's environment minister resigned Tuesday, live on the air during a radio interview. Nicolas Hulot said he made the decision due to France's failure to adequately address climate change and other environmental threats.
For the first time, I'm going to take the hardest decision of my life. I don't want to lie to myself anymore. I don't want my presence in this government to be taken to mean that we are doing enough to tackle the climate challenge. So I'm taking the decision to leave the government today.
The Atlantic magazine has revealed an immigration policy analyst with the Department of Homeland Security had direct ties to several prominent white supremacists, including Richard Spencer. The analyst, Ian M. Smith, worked at DHS up until last week. The news comes just 2 weeks after White House speechwriter Darren Beattie was fired after news broke that he had spoken at a conference alongside prominent white nationalists. Immigration news, about 160 workers in Texas were detained in an ICE raid targeting the trailer manufacturing company Load Trail. One worker described ICE agents raiding the factory from every entrance. He said, quote, they drew their guns and told everyone to hit the ground. California Governor Jerry Brown has signed legislation making California the first state in the nation to abolish cash bail. Brown said he signed the bill to ensure the rich and poor alike are treated fairly. More than 48,000 people are currently being held in California because they cannot post bail. But many criminal justice advocates, including the ACLU of California, came out against the legislation, warning it may result in more people being locked up while awaiting trial. In other news from California, lawmakers have passed a non-binding resolution that calls on the medical community to respect the rights of intersex people and affirms their right to autonomy in making medical decisions. Intersex people have long spoken out against the practice of genital surgery performed when they're too young to give informed consent. The measure is the first of its kind in the United States. And in Colorado, a 9-year-old boy died by suicide after reportedly being bullied by classmates after coming out as gay. Jamel Miles was a 4th-grade student at Joe Shoemaker Elementary School in Denver. Jamel's mother, Leah Pierce, said, quote, "We have to stop bullying and teach people it's okay to love each other. We have to stop hating each other for differences that make us equal and unique." And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Just as the school year gets underway across the United States, the top student loan watchdog has resigned in protest against the Trump administration of siding with powerful predatory lenders over student loan borrowers. Seth Frotman works as student loan ombudsman under the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Director Mick Mulvaney. In his resignation letter to Mulvaney, he wrote, quote, "Unfortunately, under your leadership, the Bureau has abandoned the very consumers it is tasked by Congress with protecting. Instead, you have used the Bureau to serve the wishes of the most powerful financial companies in America," unquote. Frotman's resignation comes as outstanding student loan debt has topped $1.4 trillion. In the letter, he accused the Bureau of failing to enforce laws that protect borrowers, defending predatory for-profit schools from scrutiny, and suppressing reports that expose banks and other bad actors, quote, ripping off students. Frotman continued, quote, "The Bureau's current leadership folded to political pressure and failed borrowers who depend on independent oversight to halt bad practices. The current leadership of the Bureau has made its priorities clear. It will protect the misguided goals of the Trump administration to the detriment of student loan borrowers."
This comes as Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has proposed new rules that would cut an estimated $13 billion in federal student loan relief for people defrauded by for-profit colleges. The changes would roll back the so-called borrower defense rule President Obama proposed after the collapse of ITT Tech and Corinthian College, which was then halted by the Trump administration. In response, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey tweeted, "Betsy DeVos rewrote the borrower defense rule to let predatory schools cheat their students and enrich their executives. No surprise." Well, for more, we go to Philadelphia to speak with Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Raab, professor of higher education policy and sociology at Temple University, author of the book Paying the Price: College Costs, Financial Aid, and Betrayal of the American Dream. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Why don't we begin with the resignation of the top student loan watchdog and what he has accused the Trump administration of. Dr. Goldrick-Raab.
Well, thank you for having me. You know, this is a bold and, I presume, necessary move for someone like Seth Frotman to undertake. He's trying to draw attention to some very serious changes, some of which are not being made public or transparent to taxpayers, that are going to affect not only our ability to afford college, to send our children to college, and to repay our own loans, but also, frankly, for our ability to just have a manageable amount of debt in the United States. These changes are going to cost us all money, and he wants to make sure that we know it.
Well, could you talk in general about the crisis facing so many millions of college students in America today in terms of student loans and student loan debt, and what has been happening under the Trump administration to deal or not deal with the problem?
Well, the crisis is created by what I call the new economics of college. This is a time where, frankly, like it or not, college is essentially mandatory for access to the middle class, for getting one's family out of poverty, and from keeping one's family from falling into poverty. But unfortunately, we have not created a financing system to actually make college attendance possible without having to take on loans. So millions of Americans are taking on loans even when they don't want to, just to be able to get access to college. Now, when they take those loans, they need to be sure that the risk to themselves is not too high. And frankly, collectively, as taxpayers, we need to be sure that those loans are not too risky to us, that they can be repaid. Now, under the Obama administration, they worked very hard to try to put some protections in place, both for taxpayers and for the borrowers themselves. For example, they wanted to make sure that if students took their loans to a certain type of college called a for-profit college, that they wouldn't be ripped off, that they would get a job afterwards, that their credential would mean something, and they would have a chance to repay their debt. What's happening now is that those protections are being removed. We're told that they're not necessary, but it was clear that they were, because we're receiving tons and tons of fraud complaints about these colleges. And that's the important work that the CFPB has been doing, is to review those fraud claims. Well, the CFPB is now being told it really can't do that work. And what Seth Frotman is telling us is that it hasn't been able to do it for some time.
I want to go back to Seth Frotman's resignation letter. He writes, "The Bureau's new political leadership has repeatedly undercut and undermined career CFPB staff working to secure relief for consumers. These actions will affect millions of student loan borrowers, including those harmed by the company that dominates this market. By undermining the Bureau's own authority to oversee the student loan market, the Bureau has failed borrowers who depend on independent oversight to halt bad practices and bring accountability to the student loan industry," unquote. The company Frotman is referencing is thought by many observers to be Navient, the nation's largest servicer of student loans, according to lawsuits filed last year by a federal regulator and 2 state attorneys general. According to lawsuits filed last year by a federal regulator, Navient has for years misled borrowers and made serious mistakes at nearly every step of the collections process, illegally driving up loans repayment costs for millions of borrowers. Can you talk more about this company and what is this relationship with Mick Mulvaney, who called his own bureau, the one that Frotman is resigning from, a joke?
Well, I think that the biggest thing that Seth is pointing out is that we don't fully understand what Mulvaney's relationships are. I think that we have some speculation as to what's going on here, but he keeps alluding to the fact that, the real issues going on inside that agency are not being made transparent. And we, I think, have the same concerns, frankly, about the U.S. Department of Education and Secretary DeVos's own relationships, both with these companies and with for-profit companies. That transparency is really key in order to be able to protect consumers. These places like Navient are servicing loans, which, a lot of people are really struggling to pay off. And many folks who are not able to repay their debt, it's not necessarily that they didn't have the money, but they weren't given the right information. The repayment process and the collections process was not transparent to them. It was not easy to follow. And so we have people who are falling into economic hardship. And defaulting on a loan is a very serious mark for somebody's economic record because these companies are not doing the right thing. I think what Seth is raising questions about is the advice and the practices of career people in Washington. And for those who don't know those folks, these are some very hardworking people who stay regardless of who's in charge of the White House and really stick by the job of these agencies and departments. And the contrast between that and what the political appointees are doing, who don't seem to really be aligned with the mission of the agency.
And what about the issue of what Congress is doing? We're talking about more than $1.4 trillion in student debt, an exploding problem in the country, and yet Congress years back ruled that in personal bankruptcy cases you can't discharge your student debt. So it basically follows you through life no matter what.
That's right. And, you know, there are some reasons, some of which are irrational, some of which are rational for those kinds of rules. I mean, but the big challenge is this. You know, Congress has not taken on in a serious way the need to create a financing system in this country that makes it possible for people to go to college without having to take on loans. That's the hard work that needs to be done, and it really hasn't happened. And for the folks who have taken on loans, they've made it incredibly hard for them to repay that debt, get out of that debt, for example, if they serve in terms of public service, if they become teachers in low-income schools. There's talk of rolling back that loan forgiveness. So, you know, it seems that Congress is at odds with the will of the American people.
Professor Goldrick-Robb, your work has been credited, your book, Paying the Price, based on a study in state colleges, not for-profit schools. But your work has been credited with really helping to lay the groundwork for Bernie Sanders' proposal for free college education. Please explain.
Well, the studies that my team and I have undertaken over the last 20 years have revealed that the current financial aid system just isn't getting the job done. In many ways, it's well-intentioned. It suggests that we can help people without money by giving them grants that they have to fill out the FAFSA to receive, this horrible bureaucratic form, this application that takes ages to fill out. You know, and that we will somehow make up for their lack of money by giving them that financial aid. We find that doesn't actually work in practice for many reasons, including that families can't get through the application. They may not have parents to fill out the application for some students who are estranged, for example, from their parents. And then there's a whole middle class in this country that find themselves, you know, too rich to qualify for grants, but too poor to be able to afford these college prices. That's where a free college model comes in. And it isn't about assuming that everything in life is free or that if you don't have to pay something, you don't work hard. But just as we value people in this country being able to go to high school, and we wouldn't want to have a country where people turned away from high school because the tuition is too high, we believe it's now time to start thinking at least about the 13th and 14th years of education as something that we need to collectively pay for so that anybody, especially anybody hardworking and talented in this country, which is the majority of people, can get the college education that they need.
And what about the for-profit industry? Because clearly you have the private nonprofit colleges, the state universities and state colleges, but there's been an explosion of the for-profit industry, and we've seen some major failures of some of these, but some continue to prosper basically on the backs of this loan program.
That's right. I mean, in many ways, the model that we're operating under is a voucher-driven model. And it allows private providers to compete for student aid dollars alongside public providers, but unfortunately with a lot less scrutiny and no public governance. And so the result is that companies have realized they can step in, they can get students to walk in their doors by recruiting them with commercials. They spend a lot of money on advertising. They bring the students in, and in many cases, not all, but in most cases, the students do not experience the sort of education that will lead them to lead a better life, get a better job, or earn more money. And it is an industry, and frankly, this is also a deeply racialized practice because these schools disproportionately reach out to, recruit, prey on people of color. And those are people who really do not have the same access to forms of payment other than student loans that other folks have. So they go into deep debt and they get useless credentials.
Finally, very quickly, Professor Goldrick-Robb, your report, Hungry and Homeless in College. You say of the students you surveyed, 1 in 3 reported they'd gone hungry while enrolled in college?
That's correct. Now, this has been a decade worth of research now, and we have found that actually it's 1 in 3 students at four-year colleges and universities, and between 40 to 50% of students at the nation's community colleges. This is how severe the loan crisis really is. You can take loans and have trouble repaying them, and nonetheless still not have enough money to cover today's college prices. And those prices are not just tuition, it's housing and food. So students are legitimately falling short of what they need to learn and to get degrees.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, and we will, of course, continue to cover this issue. Sarah Goldrick-Rab, professor of higher education policy and sociology at Temple University, author of Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream. When we come back,
thank you for having
books, not magazines. That was one of the T-shirts that a father of a student at Parkland who was killed last Valentine's Day wore. Books, not magazines, with an automatic weapon through the word magazines. We'll talk about the Education Secretary Betsy DeVos's proposal to spend federal money on arming and training teachers to shoot. Stay with us. Gone the Promises of Yesterday by 24 Karat Black. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as students across the country return to school, we turn now to calls by House Democrats for Education Secretary Betsy DeVos to reject plans to grant federal funds to states to purchase firearms for teachers and school employees. The proposal comes after requests from Oklahoma, Texas, and other states to train and arm school marshals. More than 170 Democrats, about 90% of the caucus, endorsed the letter to DeVos, arguing she has the authority to say no to such spending. The letter was organized by Representative Bobby Scott, the top Democrat on the House Education Committee. It argues, quote, arming teachers would not only jeopardize student and staff health and safety, but also run counter to congressional intent, precedent, and common sense.
DeVos's plan would use federal student support and academic enrichment grants to pay for firearms and to train educators in their use, and would reverse longstanding federal policy prohibiting federal funds for arming teachers. Last week, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut spoke out against DeVos's proposal, arguing it goes against guidelines about the use of Title IV federal funding.
Title IV language allows for money to be used to try to quell violence, but there's a specific phrase here that seems to give clear guidance to the secretary, because you can use the grants for a school environment that is free of weapons. And yet, reportedly, the secretary is about to issue guidance saying that that money can be used to load schools up with weapons. That is in direct contravention of the statute itself, and certainly in contravention of the spirit of federal education law, given the act that we passed earlier this year that prohibits school safety dollars from being used to arm teachers.
Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut speaking last week. Murphy's district is home to the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre that killed 20 children who were 6 and 7 years old, along with 6 adult staff members. Well, we're joined by Randy Weingarten now, president of the American Federation of Teachers. Also with us, Adam Skaggs, chief counsel at the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And welcome you both to Democracy Now! Adam Skaggs, let's begin with you. Talk about this proposal that Betsy DeVos is weighing.
Well, I think this proposal is, to put it in simple terms, outrageous. This violates every piece of evidence about what we need to keep student environments, to keep our schools safe. To put it simply, at a time when we are seeing schools that lack the resources to buy books, to buy school supplies for our classrooms, the idea of diverting federal funds to be used to arm teachers is not only a terrible idea, as you heard Senator Murphy saying, we believe it's unlawful as well and violates federal law.
And Randy Weingarten, the idea of using federal funds that were earmarked to assist low-income or troubled schools and turn them into basically a subsidy for the gun industry?
It's insane. I mean, it's reprehensible. It's insane. It's morally outrageous. But think about it. The funds that she wants to use, first off, last year she tried to get rid of these funds. These go for summer school programs, after-school programs, guidance counselors, restorative justice, helping kids learn how to diffuse crisis, mental health supports, which everyone, regardless of where you are on the gun debate in America, everyone believes we need to have more mental health supports in schools. And it's targeted to places that can't afford it, to poor kids. And so she, hasn't come out with any of the things that we should be doing, but she wants to divert these funds for something that will make schools less safe. It's repugnant.
And the reaction among teachers that you represent and teachers that you don't represent, what's the general sentiment?
I would say that I'm being calm compared to the reaction that I get. Well, look, there are some teachers who have said to me, I've been in the Parkland schools after I've been in Parkland, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, junior high school next door, spent some time, many times in Newtown since after Sandy Hook. And people sometimes are scared, and people say, look, maybe I should, maybe I want to. So I'm not saying that this is a universal position, but the more you think about it, the more you realize how unsafe this is. And it's frankly the people who know how to use guns who have talked to me, NRA members, about just how insane this is. Think about it, Juan. The kindergarten teacher wearing a holster with a handgun. What does that say to her children? Or where would you put guns? How would you safely lock them up? What do you do in terms of this false sense of safety if somebody is coming in with a weapon of war that can shoot 60, 80, 100 bullets a minute? So it both creates a false sense of security, and it will be more dangerous in schools. As Adam said, the only entity it seems to help is the NRA and the gun manufacturers, and that's why we are adamantly against it. Why don't we do things that make sense? Mental health supports, things like the red flag laws, which are extraordinary orders of protection that a family could get, a police officer get, maybe an educator could get, as Governor Cuomo has suggested, so that if you see a kid who may be a danger to himself or to others, you go to a judge and you ask with due process to see if we can actually assure that kid doesn't have guns. There are ways we can handle this. Arming teachers is not one of them.
I can also only think about the fact where the money is coming from, using federal funding. I mean, they're saying Oklahoma is asking for this. The Oklahoma teachers went out on strike, among the lowest paid in the country. And as they're striking, they're providing lunches to the kids because they know if the kids aren't in school, they're going to go hungry.
Lunches, books, school supplies. I mean, 25 states spend less on education today than they did before the recession, including Oklahoma. 41 states spend less on higher education. And this pot of money was for those kind of emotional supports.
I'd like to turn to Alabama Governor Kay Ivey, who introduced the, quote, Century program in the state earlier this year, enabling school administrators to carry guns.
Those school administrators who volunteer to be a part of the Alabama Century program will be trained by the Safe Council's created school safety training and compliance teams using an ALEA-designed training program, and they will be designated as a reserve deputy sheriff, authorizing them to respond to an active shooter. Volunteer administrators must undergo mental and physical fitness evaluations and a drug screening before being certified as a Sentry, and as a part of an annual recertification process. They must also have an up-to-date concealed carry permit issued by their local sheriff.
That was Governor Kay Ivey. Earlier this year, 17 students and faculty were shot dead at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, sparking nationwide protests against gun violence in schools. Following that massacre, President Trump hosted a listening session with students and families affected by the Parkland shooting, as well as families affected by past school shootings. Vice President Mike Pence and Education Secretary Betsy DeVos were also in attendance. During the session, Trump suggested the solution to school shootings is arming teachers.
It's called concealed carry, where a teacher would have a concealed gun on them. They'd go for special training, and they would be there, and you would no longer have a gun-free zone. Gun-free zone to a maniac, because they're all cowards. A gun-free zone is let's go in and let's attack, because bullets aren't coming back at us.
Adam Skaggs, what about this, the president's position of concealed carry for teachers?
Well, look, I think it's a terrible idea. I think what we need for our teachers is we need adequate resources so that they have the supplies, the books, the classroom materials that they need to teach our children. Look, we all agree that our schools should be safe environments. They should be welcoming, inclusive environments for our educators and for our students. Introducing more guns for non-professional law enforcement, for teachers, for classroom assistants is just not the way to get this done. I think when you look at the fact that groups like Giffords Law Center, which works on gun safety issues, groups like the American Federation of Teachers, we're working together with the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is an unprecedented coalition of groups that care about different issues, that focus on educational environments, that focus on gun safety. But we've all come together because we all recognize that this is a terrible idea that's going to make our students less safe. When you introduce guns into the classroom, you introduce the possibility the gun will be lost, there will be an accidental discharge, not to even underestimate the idea that a teacher under a stressful circumstance might use the weapon inappropriately. So the risks that this piles on are numerous. And on top of that, I think, as Randy said before, you have to think about what this says to a student in a classroom to see armed guards or to see teachers carrying guns. What does that do to the students, leaving aside the risk of someone being shot? What does that say that students are in this kind of environment? And I think what it says is not something that we want to tell our children.
Adam Skaggs, very quickly, today's latest news, a Texas firearms entrepreneur announcing he's selling 3D gun blueprints online despite the court order that essentially banned the distribution of such data online. Explain the significance of this.
Well, what we see is a company in Texas that wants to make downloadable guns on the Internet available for anyone, anywhere to download and essentially build their own gun. These are people, these guns would be accessible to people that can't go to a gun store and buy a firearm because they'd fail a background check. Children who are not old enough to buy guns could construct something that would have the firepower of a traditional weapon. Not to mention the fact that these plastic guns can actually make it through a metal detector and obviously present numerous security risks because of that. So at a time that we're trying to keep people safe from gun violence, the idea that we would be making lethal weapons available to dangerous people who can't pass a background check is simply a terrible idea. And thankfully, law enforcement across the country is working to combat this in states across the country.
Before we go with Juan and Randy Weingarten here, Randy, I think you've been in Puerto Rico like 11 times since Hurricane Maria. And, of course, Juan, you're one of the leading thinkers and activists on the issue of Puerto Rico and journalists covering what has happened there, born there. Talk about this latest news, our top headline, that the government has finally acknowledged that more people died as a result of Hurricane Maria than they previously said. I think they said, 64? They came to that number. Now it's 46 times that, nearly 3,000 people. Other studies put it past 5,000. What's the significance of this?
Well, it seems to me, if people remember Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Katrina was probably the low point of the Bush administration in terms of its demonstrating, the George W. Bush administration, that it was incapable of handling a disaster of the type that Katrina represented. Yet somehow the crisis in Puerto Rico and this, not only the ability to handle the immediate crisis, but then even to properly account for and count the dead, to me has to be, certainly for the government of Puerto Rico. The governor of Puerto Rico has not received, in my estimation, sufficient criticism for the failures of his government to properly address the crisis in the days after Hurricane Katrina, but also for the Trump administration. Somehow the Trump administration has managed to push the Maria crisis aside and the failure of the federal response to Katrina, so that we now have an official recognition of nearly 3,000 dead, possibly more, because it could conceivably be more, but at least now close to 3,000 dead. It's astonishing. A year later, as we're entering the 1-year anniversary of Maria. But I know, Randy, you've been there multiple times to Puerto Rico, and you've especially dealt with how the local government and the federal government have used the crisis as a prime example of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism to reconfigure the education system of the island.
It is, in some ways, colonialism at its worst in 2018. The scene 3 weeks, the first time I was there 3 weeks after the hurricane, when we could finally get commercial flights in, you went outside of San Juan and it looked like a war zone. Kids drinking water from streams. This is 2017 and 2018. And so, separate and apart from the fact that we actually got 100,000 water filters there with Operation Blessing. So picture the AFT and Operation Blessing, an evangelical Christian group working together with the mayor of San Juan and our affiliate there to do this. But you knew that number was false from the moment any person who was alive and could actually feel knew that number was wrong. But the point that Juan is making, that I don't know if it was negligence, malevolence, probably both. The utter failure to understand a hurricane on an island and prepare for that, particularly in light of what had happened in Katrina, that is a failure of the Trump administration. And you compare it to the preparation in Florida and in Houston right beforehand, and then the failure over the course of the next 3 months, as exemplified by Donald Trump just throwing paper towels. So there is a sense Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and they have not been treated that way. And then on top of it, the disaster being used as to privatize and to close a huge number of schools. Let me just say one thing about that. What I saw over the course of the next few weeks is that teachers and parents wanted their neighborhood schools, of which there are many, the same number, frankly, as in 1917. It's not as if there were many more, but it's the same number of schools in 1917, 2017. They used those schools as key to keeping communities together, particularly when there was no lights and when there was no government facilities. And so when you have those schools closed now and kids walking down streets that are still in bad shape, That is a second disaster that says to kids that your communities, which are the heart of what people believe in Puerto Rico, don't count.
Well, we're going to leave it there. And, of course, we'll continue to cover Puerto Rico. Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, Adam Skadz, Gifford's Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, chief counsel there. When we come back, we go to Texas to speak with a woman sentenced to 5 years in prison for casting a provisional ballot in the 2016 election, not understanding Texas law about what happens to people who have felony records. Stay with us. By Sudan Archives. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We end today's show with the shocking case of a Texas woman sentenced to 5 years in prison for illegally voting who could now not have even more time added to her sentence. Crystal Mason cast a provisional ballot in the 2016 presidential election despite having a past felony conviction for tax fraud that prevented her from voting. In March, she was convicted of illegal voting, but says she did not know that she was barred from casting a ballot in Texas because of her criminal record. Her supporters argue her conviction was racially biased and point to the case of Terry Lynn Rote, a white woman in Iowa, who was convicted of the same crime after she tried to vote for President Trump twice. Rote was sentenced to 2 years probation and was fined $750.
For more, we go to Fort Worth, Texas, where Crystal Mason joins us along with her attorney, Kim Cole. Crystal has a federal court hearing in Fort Worth, Texas on Thursday. That's tomorrow. If she loses the hearing, she'll be heading to prison. Also with us in Washington, Mark Maurer, executive director of the Sentencing Project, author of Race to Incarcerate, and co-editor of Invisible Punishment, The Collateral Consequences of Mass Imprisonment. According to a 2016 report by the Sentencing Project, policies restricting the voting rights of convicted felons disenfranchise more than 6 million people. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Crystal, let's begin with you. You go to court tomorrow. Explain what happened on Election Day, what you understood, what you did, and now what you're facing.
Okay. I went to go vote November 2016, and what I understood was that I could vote. So I went to the local church where I went before I went to prison, and I went to vote. When they looked on the roster, they realized my name wasn't there, and I was like, well, I've been living here for over 10 years. So when I got ready to walk away, that's when they stopped me and they told me that, hey, you can fill out a provisional ballot. And I said, what was that? They said, if you are at the right location, it'll count, and if you're not, it won't. So I didn't see any harm with that. So the lady sat me down and helped me out with it, and that's exactly what I did.
And then what happened?
Then I was arrested for illegally voting.
Several months later.
Yeah, so it was several months later. It was March 2017. That's when they arrested me for illegally voting. And I explained that exactly what the lady kept telling me. She told me, make sure everything matches on my driver's license. So that's what I kept saying was. I put everything correctly, so I didn't illegally vote. I put everything on the form correctly.
Kim Cole, you're Crystal's attorney. Could you talk about, first of all, how frequently does this happen in Fort Worth of people being prosecuted for illegal voting? And I'm surprised that in this particular case there wasn't even any attempt to plea bargain down, even if there was a violation, to some of a much lesser sentence.
This isn't prosecuted very frequently in Tarrant County, I can tell you that. There is, I guess there's a record of discriminatory prosecution, to be politically correct, I guess I will say. But there's a record of discriminatory prosecution in Tarrant County. But certainly for this particular type of offense, there's not a lot of prosecution that goes on for illegal voting.
Now, I mean, I want to... Can we compare this to that story of Terry Lynn Rote, a white woman, was convicted of the same crime as Crystal after she tried to vote for President Trump twice. Right. She was sentenced to 2 years probation and fined $750 in Iowa. Now, Crystal is going to prison for 5 years for mistakenly voting when laws change from state to state?
I think it is absolutely ridiculous. There is I'm not certain where you're from, but Tarrant County is very proud to be the largest urban red county, in the country. And they want to keep it that way. And this prosecution, in my opinion, is to send a message to minority voters to stay away from the polls. There is absolutely no reason Crystal should have been prosecuted. She was not aware that she was not eligible to vote. Texas is one of the states where convicted felons do actually have the right to vote. And so Crystal, unaware that her being on supervised release would prohibit her from voting, that she wasn't eligible until, even though she had served her prison sentence, she wasn't eligible until after her supervised release ended. And she was not aware of that. No one told her that. Her supervised release officer testified on the stand that he did not tell Crystal that she was not eligible to vote. And Crystal herself emphatically has proclaimed from day one she was not aware that she could not vote in the state of Texas. And here, for the crime of illegal voting, it requires that you vote knowing that you're not eligible, and that was not the case here. And Crystal was convicted by a judge and found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Like I said, this, in my belief, is a concerted effort to keep Tarrant County red. This judge is a Republican judge. The state's star witness was a Republican election judge. He didn't report Crystal to the police for a crime. He called up his friend, the district attorney, a Republican district attorney, called her up specifically, directly, to prosecute this case. This is a clear message to disenfranchised voters in Tarrant County and to keep minorities from the polls.
I'd like to bring in Mark Maurer, the Sentencing Project, as well. Mark, this whole issue of felon disenfranchisement across the country, are you seeing at the national level any move to reform these policies and also this selective prosecution? Are you seeing any of that as may be happening here in Fort Worth?
Right. Well, we have record numbers of people who can't vote as a result of a felony conviction, 6 million. But the encouraging news is that over the past 2 decades, a good number of states have begun to reconsider these laws. In many cases, they've been on the books for 100, even 200 years with very little scrutiny. So several states in recent years have cut back the ban on voting after you complete your sentence. Other states, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, now permit people on probation and or parole to vote too. So there's a growing movement to reconsider these policies, to scale back. Nonetheless, because of the rise of mass incarceration, the number of people with felony convictions, we still have this record 6 million people who can't vote. In terms of prosecutions, we hear stories from around the country. I don't think the numbers are that dramatic, but it's not unusual to hear this. Just recently, a prosecutor in a county in North Carolina charged 12 people with voting illegally, very similar to the situation in Crystal Mason's case. In that particular case, of the 12 who were charged, 9 of them were African American.
I mean, can't people vote in Vermont and Maine, I think it is? Can't you even vote from prison?
You can. Vermont and Maine, for many, many decades, have allowed everyone to vote, including people in prison. And internationally, that's often the norm. If you look at Western Europe, Canada, many other industrialized nations, many of them have no disenfranchisement, essentially saying that there are legitimate punishments for committing a crime, which may involve a period of incarceration, but that doesn't mean that you forfeit your fundamental rights as a citizen. We still welcome everyone into our democracy. It's a mixed up set of opinions
so
that come in democracy.
So if you move from one state to another and not realize, I mean, one place you can vote from prison, in another way, you're in another place you're imprisoned if you vote, if you're under supervised probation in a place like Texas. Is it true, Crystal, that they have told you when you go to court tomorrow, you should have your bags packed, ready to go to prison? You have 3 children?
I do.
And they told you you could go to prison tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes.
Your oldest son is just about to go to college?
He's in college. He's in college, and I go to court on the 30th, and his first game is September the 1st. It's on Friday. So he's been talking about coming home. He's down there on a football scholarship. He's been talking about coming home. I told him no, and I don't know if I'm going to make his first game.
And you could have this 5-year sentence extended to even more time tomorrow? Kim Cole, is that true?
That's true. The state sentence is currently under appeal, so she hasn't begun serving that time. However, in federal court, the judge could sentence her to up to 2 additional years in federal prison.
For having violated what she was doing under supervision, though she did not know it was wrong, thought it was a citizen's duty?
Right. That's correct. For having a new conviction for voting.
Crystal, do you ever plan to vote again?
I do. I do, and that's what I'm encouraging my kids to get out there so we can make a difference right now. I do. I just feel right now that the system failed me. You get out, you rehabilitate yourself, you get a good job, you go to school, you graduate from school, you're doing everything right. So why would I go and vote to go back to prison? Why would I do something like that to lose my kids again, to start all over again? You know? Through all of this, I lost a good job. Through all of this, so it's like I'm going backwards instead of forward.
Crystal Mason, we have to leave it there. I want to thank you and Kim Cole and Mark Maurer. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.